Oh, keep chatting. We still have a couple more minutes, so keep going, whatever you're doing. Make sure your phone is on the silence mode, if you can, possibly. I'll do the same here. Silence mode. Good. Ten more seconds. Countdown. All right, 6 o'clock sharp, so. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the inaugural Lerude First Amendment Distinguished Lecturer Forum. This event is presented by the Reynolds School of Journalism with support from the Lerude Family Endowment. Thank you. For those of you who have not met, I am Dean Yoon of the Reynolds School of Journalism. While the Reynolds School has been supporting and aiming to uphold the First Amendment for over 100 years, tonight's program is the first Distinguished Lecturer Forum of its kind. It is all thanks to Warren and Janet Lerude. Thank you. While Warren needs no introduction, agree? Good. Well, I'll do a little bit. Warren Lerude is an alumnus and professor emeritus at the Reynolds School, where for nearly 30 years, he taught First Amendment and Society, Media Law and Ethics, and guided professional internships for many years. In 1977, as editor of the Reno Evening Gazette and the Nevada State Journal, he led a team of 3 editorial writers to win the Pulitzer Prize in journalism. He also guided one of the nation's strongest confidential source, Reporter Shield laws, through the Nevada legislature. We're enjoying those right now. His crucial contribution to press freedom of Nevada and the nation is invaluable, as we all know. Warren and his wife, Janet, met on this campus 63 years ago, just like yesterday. While Warren was the Sagebrush editor and Janet was a song leader, the First Amendment is a very important part of this today's event, and the free flow of news and public information has been the common thread they shared since then, over 60 years. And thanks to their support of these initiatives, we're all here tonight to hear from the lecturer and the discussant, 2 experts in the field about critically important issues facing our journalists and our democracy today. Thank you, Warren and Janet, again. Thank you. Now, please welcome Associate Professor of Media Law and Director of Graduate Studies, Professor Patrick File. He will introduce our distinguished lecturer for tonight's discussion.
Good evening. Just let me add my thanks to the Lerude family for helping make tonight possible, or really making tonight possible. So, just a couple of quick introductions, and then I'll get us started here. Our first speaker and our distinguished lecturer is Professor Justin I think I was going to mispronounce your last name for some reason. Justin Marceau, excuse me. He's a professor of law, the Brooks Institute Faculty Research Scholar of Animal Law and Policy, and the faculty director of the Animal Law program at the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. Forgive my reading. When we have distinguished guests, they have long bios. We got to read a little bit. I can't memorize all of it, and I promise I won't read all of it either. So his research and expertise is broadly focused on criminal law, civil rights, and animal law, and has done extensive research on habeas corpus and capital punishment, and is an expert in those fields. I'll also just add a couple of the awards that he has won that has been a visiting professor at Harvard Law School and at UC Irvine. One of my favorites, though, here is that in 2023, he was selected by Vox as one of the Future Perfect 50, which honors 50 people across the world who are recognized for their distinct efforts to make the future better, which I thought that was a pretty great honor. We should all aspire to. You would have seen his book out front, which gets a little bit more to why the sort of First Amendment Forum, sponsored by a school of journalism, and why Justin is here to talk about that. Truth and Transparency, Undercover Investigations in the 21st Century looks at just that. And I think that his talk, hopefully, I believe, will help kind of help us think broadly and in some interesting ways about how his experience and background in animal rights law and undercover investigations can help us think, again, kind of in some interesting ways and important ways as it relates directly into journalism, and that sort of, in a moment where hopefully we are thinking more broadly about what journalism is and what it can be. So that is Justin, and he'll get up and talk first. We also are very lucky to have Gabe Rottman here, who will be a discussant after Justin gives his talk, and they're going to probe a little bit deeper into some of the issues that the book raises and that the talk will raise. Gabe is the Vice President of Policy at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, where he works to advance key policy priorities like the Press Act, which is a really important piece of legislation working its way through Congress on protecting press rights. He also works on the Department of Justice News Media Guidelines, or has done work on that as well. He's a practicing attorney with a focus on novel issues at the intersection of press freedom, news gathering, and technology, and these two folks' paths have crossed in some litigation on undercover reporting and those kinds of investigations, particularly where sort of electronic media is involved. So with no further ado, Justin, come on up and we'll hear your remarks, and you'll see Gabe in just a minute after Justin is finished.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I got a tall guy. I'd like you to imagine what the U.S. would look like if there were not any undercover investigations. How would our country be different if undercover investigations had not revealed some hard truths about our healthcare system, our prisons, our food system? And what does the First Amendment, in particular the protections for free speech, have to say or have to teach us about undercover investigations, a particularly thorny area of journalism? These are some of the broad strokes questions that I'm going to address tonight in my remarks, but I do want to just echo the fact that it's a really great honor to be here with you all. As a professor in Colorado, I can tell you that one of the ways that I measure the success of something in our university is the engagement with the public and the ability to have people who are not just students and not just faculty coming onto campus and engaging with ideas. So it's in that way, it's particularly special and a real testament to what all of you have accomplished. So thank you. And I'm really grateful to Professor Feil for hosting me, all the faculty for just being so hospitable, and of course the dean. I'm also really honored to be here with Gabe. Gabe is, some of the work that he has worked on is featured in the book. I don't think you're in by name, at least the indexer didn't catch it, but is an unsung hero also in the book. So really grateful. And to you all, I mean, it's been great just to, I won't go on about the accolades, but to meet the Lerude family today has been special, and I see why everybody likes you guys so much. So thank you. I won't say anything else about that. I'm going to divide my remarks into two portions. One is kind of talking generally about the context and where we are with undercover investigations and what I think they are, because even that term is somewhat debated in the literature. Just providing this historical overview in a certain sense. One thing that I should say up front is that for as long as we have had a 14th Amendment, and for the lawyers in the room, you know that the 14th Amendment, the ratification of the 14th Amendment, made the First Amendment, the free speech clause, applicable to the states. Like the free speech clause does not by itself apply to the states. And so as long as we have had a 14th Amendment, we have had high-profile and very important undercover investigations. That was true during the Civil War. It was true during the execution of John Brown. It was true during the Civil War as Northern journalists posed as various kinds of people in the South to report on what was happening during the Confederacy and with slavery. So undercover investigations have a long history in this country, and I'll talk a bit more about the context and how I define undercover investigations. And then I'm going to talk about some of the legal puzzles, in particular the First Amendment puzzles that these types of journalism present. And even as I walked in the room, it was refreshing. As I walked in the room and I heard somebody talking about a journalist being accused of a breach of a duty of a loyalty, and these are words that sing to me, because this is the kind of stuff that I spend a lot of time thinking about: is how do these various doctrines, torts like loyalty, and trespass and the like, and crimes with different names that we'll talk about, how do these impede efforts to bring transparency? How do these impede efforts to have frank conversations about what's going on? And then if there's time, I would like to, and if not, I'll do some with the conversation with Gabe. But my co-author and I, Alan, commissioned and did the first set of social science experiments that I'm aware of looking at public opinion regarding undercover investigations, and I could talk a little bit about those. But the sort of short point is, this is chapter 6 of the book if you end up reading it, but there's this long-standing set of assumptions about undercover investigations, that they're unseemly, that the public doesn't like them, that only certain sorts of reporters have the gravitas to pull it off. And what our research reveals in sort of nationally representative samples is that's far, far from true. And that in fact, and that's a nice place to start, even journalists doing so explicitly for money, even activists doing so explicitly for a political cause, are widely accepted by the public and overwhelmingly celebrated if they reveal something that was otherwise unknown. So we can talk about the merits of that. Let me start by defining a little bit what I think of undercover investigations, what that means, and how it fits in to the legal framework. But as a starting point, I should just say that we take as a starting point in this book that two important things are under attack and at risk in this country. And that's both democracy and the field of journalism. This isn't something that we wrote, last week or 2 weeks ago. We think those things are serious. On the website for the Reynolds School, I saw a great quote from Oscar Wilde that I had never seen before, which said that presidents reign for 4 years and journalism is forever. And we sort of have that operating assumption here. But one of the things that we say in the book is that it's far less clear with the changes in the economies of newsrooms and the way that the public reacts to news and obtains news, that the fourth branch of government is as strong and as everlasting as it was once assumed to be. There's lots of things that we touch on without diving deep into, including the idea that broadcasting stations don't even purport to be nonpartisan in many instances now. We talk about the fact that there could come a time when there would be, in chapter 1, we talk about the idea that there could come a time when editorial boards for newspapers would impose content limits on op-eds, which seemed sort of sci-fi when we wrote it, but we said this could happen. And we say unequivocally that there is no question that foreign and domestic entities are engaged in the process of putting out fake news, right? Whatever term you want to use. It is an unquestioned reality, and they do so for various reasons, including to, decrease support for institutions, to push an agenda. But there's no question that that is true. I don't come tonight with easy answers to any of these shifts. I'm certainly not here to offer a take on Jeff Bezos' Washington Post policies or to offer a silver bullet for the problems of fake news. But one of the things that the book makes the case for, and that I think is important to reflect on about undercover investigations, is that they are a tool that helps us generate and disseminate demonstrably and verifiably true facts. And for me, and one of the motivations for writing this book, that's an important check on the nihilism and the hopelessness that many people of all political stripes feel, because they come to feel that there's nothing that can be done, nothing that can be changed, no way to reason with other people. We've seen footage, many of us have, I have seen it, even in reviewing for this book, in old political rallies and more recent political rallies, where when somebody is confronted with a fact that is inconsistent with the sign they're holding or the chant that they are saying, that they just say, well, that's just your news, or that's fake news, or some version of that. We've all seen some version of that. And I think that facts really do matter. Demonstrably true facts are more important than ever to get out to the public, is sort of the thesis and the claim of the book. And I think that undercover investigations promise one, not the only, but one vehicle for exposing these kind of truths, and that they're important. So I don't have this view that they're going to solve everything, but my claim, again, to just sort of put it as simply as possible, is a very modest one, but I think one, and hopefully one, that Mr. Lerude's career helps illustrate, that facts on the ground, that ground truths do matter, right? That this will always matter, and that it should continue to matter, and that in a digital age, the ability to have digital evidence and facts that are verifiable is going to matter more and increasingly over time. And I don't take the position in the book or here tonight that the exposure of facts, that the revelation of a video that shows that something is true will change public opinion, and it's an even more complicated question of whether public opinion will change political will in this country. I don't take that sort of simplistic view, but I do think that without the ability to reach core agreement on what the facts on the ground are, it's very difficult to have reasoned debate and to move forward. And so that's in part my interest in undercover investigations. Grows all the way back to my undergraduate degree in philosophy. One of my favorite philosophers was Hannah Arendt. And in writing about Nazi Germany, one of the things that she said that many of you have probably come across is she reminded us that unlike opinions, facts are stubborn. And she said they don't disappear just because historians or sociologists refuse to learn them. And our sort of thrust in this book, and it's an academic book, it's not a work of advocacy, but if you read it, you can't miss a normative assumption that undercover investigations are affirmatively good. We would sort of add to that quote just that photos and audio and video are also stubborn, that they're going to be part of the stubbornness that is a vanguard against slips into forms of government and policies we don't want. So, when I'm talking to law students, and I'm a law professor, I don't tell them that if they marshal the right facts, they're always going to win their case. Or if they marshal the right set of facts, they're going to be able to achieve social change. But as I said to you, I do tend to believe that if they don't marshal those facts, it's much harder to produce the change that they want. So that's sort of where I start from. In terms of what I think undercover investigations are, I think having groundwork definitions is important. And the way that I tend to define them, we do so in two ways in the book. The first is to just distinguish them from investigative journalism, right, in general. I think of investigative journalism, and as we use the term in the book, as an umbrella term. So in that sense, investigative journalism, of course, includes things like Watergate, Bernstein and Woodward. It includes exposés that are typed up from whistleblowers. It includes, following sources, doing open records work. It includes all of that. And it probably also includes undercover investigations. But the point is, not all investigative journalism is undercover journalism, right? This probably seems simple, but quite often in the past, researchers, and particularly quantitative researchers, in studying this, have asked questions about investigative journalism and undercover investigations in the same sort of survey, in the same sort of poll. And they've tried to gauge public interest or public support by clumping them together. And so one of the things that we try to do in this book is to distinguish and say, we think both are important. And we probably think that all undercover investigative journalism is investigative, but not all investigative journalism is undercover. And again, that's not to say, if you are interested in the sort of the nuance, we don't think that every time somebody goes undercover, it is journalistic, right? There are people that go undercover for purposes of sexual exploitation, just to mock someone on TikTok, all of these kinds of things. We're not saying that that's journalism, but when you're engaging in certain practices in order to reveal truths, we think that is. So then what are the affirmative elements of an undercover investigation? We say that there are essentially 4 elements. The first is that it will generally involve deception. We'll talk more about what the deception might entail or might not entail, but it generally does involve omissions or affirmative lies. We say that the deception has to be an important part of gaining access to the area or to the information, right? So it's not just peripheral, it's not just funny, it's that the deception is a critical ingredient to the access. Third, the undercover investigation has, as part of its operation, documenting the facts and the information that's coming. So, a century ago, a century and a half ago, that might have looked quite different than it does now. Now we are frequently talking about recordings, and that kind of thing, which I'll talk about when we talk about the First Amendment. And then fourth, we deem it to be undercover investigations for purposes of journalism when the goal is to expose some sort of truths relevant to the public interest. The lawyers know how vague that term is. It's a term that is also used in the law of defamation. It's been around since New York Times versus Sullivan and before. So it's not a new term, but it's not going to answer and satisfy all of your questions. But it's a limit that we put on it. We are interested in undercover work that is relevant to matters of public concern. So before I dig into some of the legal and ethical concerns that we spend most of the time in the book sort of plumbing, I want to just note that we dedicated the book to undercover investigators. And the reason that we did that is just worth pausing for 30 seconds to reflect on. And that is, and probably some of you have experienced this, but in our research and in studying this as an academic and interviewing people who do this work, it's really hard to miss what a toll undercover investigation takes on people. And we've seen it take a variety of tolls, and I think it's taken for granted when it comes out. And maybe the person is lucky enough to win a prize, but often they don't. So my colleague, Alan, interviewed people who did the Food Lion investigation and others for ABC, which we can talk more about. But in essence, these people were engaging in very important food safety investigations, but the technology was such at the time that they had to wear battery packs all the time. And the battery packs got hot. And one of the investigators that he talked to still has burn scars on his body from wearing the battery packs to this day, right? And then the Food Lion appeal was decided in the 1990s. I recently spoke to an investigator who's been undercover for a long period of time and still is in a large corporation. And it's a potentially big story at some point. But she was reflecting on the fact that her work friends don't know her, and her real friends, is the term that she used, don't really know her either because they don't know what she's doing at work. And she doesn't talk about that. And one of the things that she said to me that really stood out was that sometimes it's confusing because she forgets where the lies end and the truth begins because she's living this dual life. And it's a major psychological toll. And I don't need to talk in this audience. I think everybody is probably aware of the threats and online nastiness that half of the country will give you if you talk about one side, and the other half will give you if you talk about the other side. I mean, it's just a fact. And so if you expose somebody of political import on one side or the other, it's pretty common. We've talked to a lot of people who have had pretty bad days because of that. So, but let's talk now a little bit about the legal and ethical considerations with undercover investigations. And the first thing I want to do is acknowledge that this is morally contested terrain, right? I doubt that everyone here agrees about the morality of engaging in the practices I just defined them, right? I talked today to Caesar Andrews, who is just a brilliant professor at your school here, and I loved what he said. He said that he told his students, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if I get it wrong, you call me out. But he said that he tells his students, when it comes down to undercover investigations, don't do it. And he said, ... unless. But the advice is don't do it. And I think that's probably generally sound advice. I think it often comes from a hybrid. I mean, one of the things we discovered in reading some of the journalism literature is it's a hybrid of legal and ethical concerns. And sometimes people are talking about their ethical concerns, and they really mean that they're afraid that there's legal liability. And sometimes people are talking about their legal liability, and they're framing it as ethical. There's a lot there I could talk about. But I think that the intuition that drives this kind of wise professorial advice is that there is a lie, right? And sometimes it's a big lie. Sometimes it's a small lie, right? Like changing your name or changing the spelling of your name. And we've had clients like that. But sometimes it's a really big lie. And the question that everyone has to confront when they're thinking about these is, well, is that okay, right? And if you take some sort of deontological view, or you have a very strong adherence to a code that it cannot be breached, you're never going to think this is okay, right? And it won't be. My co-author and I take a more consequentialist or explicitly utilitarian view, and we think that sometimes the benefits of engaging in this kind of deception outweigh the costs. Now, these are going to be few and far between. I don't know if it's my advice would be as conservative as Professor Andrews for people, but I would be advising them as a lawyer. But it is definitely the case that, if you were just going by the 10 Commandments, this is always wrong. I limit it, and I think it's important to think about where you would constrain undercover investigations if you had sort of the power in law or morality to do so. We say that it should only happen, undercover investigations should only happen when there is no other way to get that information. But again, that's a slippery standard. So take, for example, a recent example within the last 12 months. Film journalist Lauren Windsor. She entered a Supreme Court Historical Society gala. It's a place where generally wealthy people hobnob with the Supreme Court justices. The Supreme Court justices don't get out on the town a lot, but they do go to this gala. And Ms. Windsor recorded a conversation with Justice Alito. I'm not going to go into the details of it. You can look it up. It's not super revealing, but he says some awkward things about whether the political right and the political left can ever coexist peacefully, and he has some awkward silence about kind of separation of church and state. But it's not a flattering revelation. But the reason I bring that example up is that investigation, once it became public, was greeted with the sort of standard, I would say, for the day, set of responses. So, for example, leading journalism ethics scholar Jane Kirtley told the New York Times, quote, "Most ethical journalists deplore those kind of techniques." So Professor Kirtley may be right. It's an empirical question. We think it's a bit more mixed whether it's most or not, but you in the journalism school may have a better read on that. But it's certainly the case that there is a strong, and I would say growing at this moment, I view undercover investigations as kind of rising and declining popularity over time since the Civil War. We could talk about those eras. But it's definitely the case that they are in disfavor right now and that they are viewed as unseemly. Maybe that's because people think that Project Veritas is uniquely unseemly. Maybe it's because of an investigation they saw that they didn't like. But they are in lower public esteem by some measures. And Professor Kirtley embodies that view. Another journalistic nonprofit on ethics said that they, quote, had never seen a defensible example of undercover investigations. So I'm not here to defend that investigation, and like I said, I don't think it's a particularly revelatory one. But it is interesting because how would that cut for you if you learned that somebody was secretly recording Chief Justice Roberts or Samuel Alito? They want privacy. They're just trying to have a glass of champagne. They don't want their conversations recorded. On the other hand, right, notice a few things about the Supreme Court that make them perhaps uniquely situated to be deserving of undercover investigations. The decisions of the Supreme Court are of immense importance at this time, and they always have been, but they're deciding matters that everything from reproductive health to campaign finance in rapid succession. Contrary to my advice, even my law students continue to heroize justices, so they wear justices' T-shirts, and RBJ kind of started this plague. But it's popular to sort of think of justices as cool figures, politicians, and in that way they have a public persona, and we can't really escape the reality that at this point in history, judges are assessed based on their personal political values, right? If we know that if the president loses a case, just as soon as that order comes out, we will know what party the judge was, at least if the party was not his own. And so that the politics of the judges have become relevant in a way that before, right, even law professors might not be able to mention the political party of every justice on the court. But now the general public knows which justices were appointed by a Democrat. It's also the case that the justices are appointed for life, of course, and perhaps particularly relevant, it is the case that there is no open records laws with the Supreme Court, right? They don't exist. You can't. There is no FOIA. There is nothing that you can do to gain that information. So again, this isn't to say it should happen or it shouldn't happen, but an undercover investigation about the personal political leanings of a sitting Supreme Court justice could arguably be a matter of public interest. These are sort of the harder questions. But again, right, there's a deception. And the deceptions that drive these undercover investigations can be pretty major, right? Today at lunch, we were discussing the Mirage bar. In 1977, for those of you who don't know, the Chicago Sun-Times opened a bar, right? They did so, and they did so to expose local political corruption and kickbacks. And they wrote a 25-part series that was groundbreaking at the time. And if you go back and read it, it's still remarkable journalism. And that would not have been possible, right? Despite the after-the-fact critiques, I remain convinced it would not have been possible if they had not done just what they did. They had reporters serving as bartenders. They owned a bar. I mean, that is quite a lie, right? I mean, this is not, sort of like fudging that you have a PhD in journalism when you apply to work at Food Lion, right? It worked. But what's notable, right, and Mr. Lerude pointed this out, is that Ben Bradley on the Pulitzer Committee said, and I wrote this quote down this afternoon, quote, "It's biblical, man. How can newspapers fight for honesty and integrity when they themselves are less than honest?" So of course that is the counterpoint, and that is Professor Kirtley's point as well, right? That there is a dishonesty that's inherent. What should we do with that? I don't know quite what to make of Ben Bradley's statement in explaining why the Chicago Sun-Times should not get a Pulitzer Prize, because as we note in the book, there's at least 2 Pulitzer Prizes in Chicago, in the Chicago Tribune, in that same decade for undercover investigations. And one of them was William Gaines's investigation just a year earlier of hospitals, where he went undercover as a janitor and the surgeons would ask janitors just to step in and help, or in surgeries, and he documented that. And another Pulitzer Prize winning was William Jones, I think is the name, and just earlier that same decade, looking at private ambulance companies. So this is all part of what undercover investigations are. They can be small lies, but they can also be really, really big lies. They can be creating a bar that did not exist. So, again, think about that. That's part of the problem. Think about how big you would lie. Think about the number of issues you would want to expose. And then I want to turn a little bit to the law and how the First Amendment intersects with some of these questions explicitly. I'm going to mention 3 statutes and how these 3 statutes get entangled in some free speech puzzles as they relate to undercover investigations. The first statute, set of statutes, is one that I think probably Gabe knows much more than me about. But these are what we call anti-SLAPP laws. And so for a long time, powerful interests would sue investigators, journalists, activists, just in general troublemakers, and they would sue them for defamation. Many of you are probably aware of this. It still happens. I just defended a suit on these for some activists a few years ago. And the point of these cases, that's why they're called SLAPP cases, strategic lawsuits against public participation. The coin was termed by my colleague Rock Pring, who wrote a book by that name several decades ago. But the term SLAPP, right, strategic lawsuits against public participation, is a really accurate description of suing somebody not because you expect to win, but suing them because maybe they're going to run out of money and they're going to stop doing this kind of practice. Maybe they're going to stop investigating you. Maybe they're going to stop doing undercover work. And one of the things that the Reporters Committee does a lot of is work to advance anti-SLAPP laws. And this really started in the 1990s. I think California was the first state, but we had the spread of those laws in the 90s and the 2000s, and Gabe told me just today that they are continuing to expand and they've had some recent successes. This is a big deal, right? It's a big deal because investigators are emboldened and empowered to not face the threat of civil liability for saying things that are true, right? Remember, truth is a defense to defamation. And the fear here was that they were saying things that they thought were probably true, they were mostly true, they had good reason to believe they were true, but then they were going to get the daylight suit out of them, right? And there's a period of US history, as I talked about, there are arcs, there are ups and downs in the popularity and the prevalence of undercover investigations. And one of the things we attribute a pretty sharp decline in undercover investigations to was a fear of defamation liability in the middle of the 20th century. Perhaps not coincidentally, of course, too many factors to control for, including Watergate. But by the 1970s, 1990s, undercover investigations were much more popular again, and particularly after some of these anti-SLAPP laws came to be. So that's pretty good, and it's pretty important. But you know what SLAPP laws don't cover? They don't cover privacy torts. They don't cover property law claims relating to trespass. And so what this means is that persons trying to stop undercover investigations, in my experience, have started resorting to those. They've brought lawsuits under breaches of duty of loyalty and other things that aren't covered by SLAPP suits. The other thing that anti-SLAPP laws don't protect against is criminal prosecution. So I'm going to talk about 2 statutes. The SLAPP statutes are a very good example of laws that have been enacted to help further the First Amendment's protection of undercover investigators. But 2 quick examples that illustrate the way statutes could cut the other way. One type of statute is a statute that would ban deception. Now we can talk about what those mean and what deceptions are. The key case here from the Supreme Court is a 2012 Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court said that lying is generally speech. It's a fractured decision. And the Supreme Court upheld lying as speech in the context of a person lying about winning the Medal of Honor. So the statute was criminalizing lying about military honors. Nobody is particularly sympathetic to somebody, and this guy seemed particularly unsavory. He wanted to be elected to the local water board. I don't know why. And just as Kenny described him as just sort of seeking attention, but he wanted to be on the water board. So he started saying he won the Medal of Honor. It was all a lie. But the Supreme Court essentially said that the cure, this is one of those instances where the cure would be worse than the disease, right? It's not good. Nobody likes people lying about winning the Medal of Honor. But the cure, if the cure was to come in and say, we're going to make sure that whenever you lie, you can go to prison, that might actually be worse, because you're going to chill people from trying to do things and say things, and if their memory is hazy and the like. So how is that relevant to undercover investigations? Well, there are examples of laws that Mark Bittman of the New York Times coined the term ag-gag laws, but they are laws that made it a crime to engage in deception, among other things, to enter a facility to engage in an undercover investigation, specific to agricultural production. And so along with other sets of lawyers, we challenged those laws and said, because the effect, and as I said today at lunch, the very first client we had was actually a journalist from a local newspaper, and they were deterred from doing a story about migrant labor at a slaughterhouse because of this law. The law essentially made it a crime for every act of undercover journalism that targeted this particular agricultural industry. Other laws that are of this genre, they pop up, right? There are, as I mentioned today to a few people, there are laws that criminalize impersonation. There are some private investigator laws that tread close to this. But I will just note, right, that because of the decision in U.S. versus Alvarez and the general free speech protection for lies, our position in this book, and what we think we defend quite well, is that deceptions used to gain access to information of public concern is protected speech. That kind of journalistic behavior is absolutely First Amendment protected. And we have, for the most part, won on those claims, but there's still more litigation to be done. The second and last type of law that I'll mention tonight are bans on recording. And you've all come across these in one form or another. There have been recording bans of videos. There have been police officers who have attempted to just kind of roguely say you can't record me because there was no law saying you could or you couldn't, and so they would enforce that kind of thing. But the question that the Supreme Court has never answered is, what does the Constitution, what does free speech have to say about recording? And the view that we advance in the book, I would say, is a little more nuanced than the sort of conventional, the reflexive answer that you would get if you asked most people in public. Most people at the time we were writing the book tended to say, and this was before, this time of writing that, it was before George Floyd, people tended to say, well, just as you can't go into the symphony and record them, you can't record the movie on the theater, recording is not speech, it's not protected. But the view that we advance is, it's a little bit subtle, but I would just say I think it's probably right, which is that there's a big difference between what you can do in private and what the state can do. And so I can have rules about recording me in my office. I can say that I don't invite anyone to my home that records me without my permission. And if I find you recording me in my home, I will probably ask you to leave, or at least really be curious why you're recording me. Right? It's not social behavior. It's not pro-social behavior to record your friends and to do that sort of thing. But that's very different than the state of Nevada, for example, saying there is no recording allowed in Walmarts, right? Walmart might kick you out if you're recording. They might not even want you taking pictures of their price tags. And that might be within their authority to grant and deny permission to enter. But the state passing a law or trying to prosecute a person for trespass who is doing just that presents different First Amendment issues. And so what we unpack in the book is the idea that recording is, in fact, speech activity. You can't just go downstream. No one doubts that viewing a movie is speech. And if you were to say, oh, yes, but you can't take the steps of making a movie because that's not really speech, it's just making a movie, that would be very problematic, right? To use a simpler example, no one thinks it would be okay to tax the ink of a particular newspaper at a high rate to drive them out of business. That's no better than saying you cannot operate as a newspaper. The same would be true from taking away the ability of reporters to make the videos that they then post or report on. I'm not going to go into the details of the case, but one of the case study I was going to give you is in short, so that I could sit down and bring Gabe up, was a case that I'm working on as an amicus for Project Veritas. And Project Veritas has challenged an Oregon one-party recording statute. And the challenge is pretty, in my view, well-founded. They've essentially said Oregon makes it a crime if you record a conversation without everyone's consent. And Project Veritas says this is problematic from a First Amendment perspective. Now, notably, it's different than the ag-gag laws and some of the other provisions I've mentioned because it's not about video, right? It's actually about audio. And so, even as you're still processing whether you like me or don't like me because of Project Veritas, which again, is just the First Amendment in my view, and shift in the discomfort in your seat, you can also sort of reflect on the reality that a group like Project Veritas is only talking about audio, not video. And so the state's response was actually video is good enough. They actually said, you already won these cases. There's a case that I worked on, and along with Gabe, that there is a right to record, but you just don't need the audio. But imagine, again, what is the power of the claim when you have no audio, right? What is a sexual harassment video where the man making the crude jokes, you can't hear his voice, you can just see him making them. We can think about our own president and denials of things that have been said or not said, and other politicians, right? Even thinking about, I mentioned George Floyd, the horrific death of George Floyd in May of 2020, right? The video is horrific, but the audio became like a slogan, right, for an entire movement. So we feel pretty confident that these restrictions implicate the First Amendment, and at this particular political moment, whether you are a fan of it or an opponent of it, with this particular Supreme Court, Project Veritas might be the ideal plaintiff to go before the US Supreme Court and argue that recording bans violate the First Amendment. So I think with that, I will close. I'll just say that, for us, one of the things that we try to accomplish in this book is highlighting the role of transparency. I was always motivated as a law student by Justice Brandeis's quote, 1913, I think, in Harper's, where he said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. The view is not that, in my view, that it will always disinfect and that it disinfects perfectly. It's just that you can never disinfect if you don't have that transparency. So with that, thank you. I'm sorry if I went over, Patrick.
Are we live? Okay. Justin, that was amazing. Thank you, so much for all this, and thanks for having me here as well. So I have many questions for you, but I wanted to just drill down on one. So you talked a lot about how your approach to this does turn on the notion of public concern. And the conversation about how the various laws apply, it reminds me of other contexts, not involving undercover investigations, but involving instances where journalism, in public interest journalism, can be seen as violative of some law. And so the Bartnicki case that we were talking about earlier, a case that held from the early 2000s that journalists who receive information that may have been acquired illegally by a third party, and where the journalist has no involvement in the underlying illegality, but where the publication of that information or the use of that information or the possession of that information could theoretically violate some statute. The Bartnicki case, we media lawyers tend to construe that case as pretty broad and providing pretty broad protection. But that case famously also limits itself by requiring the information to be of public concern. So my question is, how do you delimit what is and what is not public concern, and is that an impossible question? And I'm sorry for asking it.
No, I appreciate it. I mean, I bet some of the journalists in the audience have a better radar for that than me. I mean, I would be interested in where your organization has come down on it. I mean, you know, union corruption and intimidation in Bartnicki seems like quintessential. What I have tended to do, and it's an obvious lawyer cop-out, is to say what I think is not matters of public concern. And so, you know, even when it comes to recording and images of speech, I'm not convinced that, you know, revenge porn type actions are going to have First Amendment protection, at least not that's going to win the day and invalidate those statutes. I don't think that there's going to be a right to engage in peeping Tom behavior or record in bathrooms or any of those things. I don't think that I think that it gets close when you have the kind of classic Pulitzer Prize winning medical type fraud in somebody's home. Mm-hmm. You know, we sometimes have these quacks who offer home care, but I generally think things in the home of a person are more questionable. But again, would I rule out the possibility that a U.S. senator, you know, selling drugs is not a matter of public concern? I mean, I would be there. So I'm pretty far on the absolutist view of public concern, and I list it as a carve out or an exception, really as a nod to the reality that I think there are some things that would so turn our stomach that we would all agree that this is not what the public should be doing. I mean, I don't know if it's Hulk Hogan in bed, you know, or what it is, but you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and so this is a good segue into the third thing that you were going to cover, which I was very curious about. We were talking about earlier. You've done some of the first quantitative research into public opinion around these undercover investigations, and I was frankly surprised to hear that the findings are surprising, and that people generally see these things as pretty positive. I work in this area, and you know, I think about like Dateline, you know, or you know, sort of gotcha, what you might think of as gotcha, and so I was just curious about your findings there, and also if you have any thoughts as to why those opinion trends may be the way they are.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, briefly, I'll just say, I mean, I would also be interested in the audience's experience with this kind of thing. We did, and it is chapter 6. It'd be a great one to read, but it's basically a nationally representative public poll and then experiment with persons where they were given, you know, it's over 1,000 people were given just a definition of undercover investigations, very much like the one I gave you, and asked kind of on a 5-point Rickert scale, like, you think that undercover investigations are very important, somewhat important, and then all the way down to not important at all, you know. And in the baseline conditions, sort of control group, 92% of Americans across all demographics, across parties, said that undercover investigations were important, very important, or somewhat important, which is like no political person I've talked to has said that, has considered that, and it's kind of a slap in the face to the lack of a legislative lobby we were talking today for kind of transparency and undercover investigations. The other thing that we found that was really interesting is that any journalistic entity, so we tested messages and messengers, so the different messengers of undercover investigations could be a truly independent nonprofit. It could be, we used as coded for liberal the New York Times, but that's just by other public perceptions, and we used Fox News as conservative. And it turns out that the public in general, and again in a bipartisan way, is always supportive of undercover investigations no matter who the outlet is. I'm not going to understate it, the public trusted, even the Republicans, and particularly younger Republicans trusted the New York Times more than they trusted Fox News in a statistically significant way, which was notable. But persons exposed to undercover investigations by Fox News that were Democrats were still grateful for the undercover investigation and still reported kind of higher levels of trust for it. The one thing that I'll note, and it's an interesting caveat, is that in a lot of the literature we had read about undercover investigations, and I think it's sort of the assumed wisdom, is that this is only true if you're kind of disinterested, if you don't have a dog in the fight, if you're not going to profit from the undercover investigation or it's not part of your political cause. And so we did a specific study and manipulation of that. And you know, it's too detailed to go into in great detail, but there's 5 different investigative scenarios, everything from human trafficking to animal abuse to, you know, all kinds of things, and abortion. And what we found is that the support for undercover investigations did not drop because it was done by an activist or an undercover entity associated with the cause. So if your cause was animal protection and you investigated animal protection, I assumed there would be a strong drop in public interest in the investigation or trust in it, and that was not true. But the one time that there was not an increase in public support for specific investigations and actually a slight decrease, it's very much a sign of the times, was undercover investigations by a politically motivated group about reproductive health, about abortion, right? So the time we were running those studies, Center for Medical Progress and Project Veritas was out there. There was the one, right, instance where support for undercover investigations dipped. But overall, the support, and we've been talking to NGOs about this, the support for undercover investigations is remarkably high. People like to know what's going on. Some of them were about mayors. People like to know that their mayor is taking expensive trips to the spa. So it's. I thought it really changed the way, because we were fully expecting to write the last chapter saying, we're in a divided country, and Republicans like investigations of Democrats, and Democrats like investigations of Republicans. But we controlled for party, we controlled for age, we controlled for education and income. It really didn't matter. People liked to have that transparency, even above party loyalty, which is a remarkable thing in this day and age.
So I just wanted to tag back to the beginning of your lecture. This notion of taking a utilitarian kind of consequentialist approach, recognizing that there may be some trade-offs to this type of activity. And one of the consequences, one of the benefits of this type of activity that you pointed to was you can get things, video recordings, audio recordings, documentary material that are incontrovertible. What happens if that type of material as a technical matter is controvertible? And as a technical matter, again, is that going to happen? In other words, is it an arms race of identifying that, being able to, we were talking about percentage-wise, what does that look like today?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I will say, like, if I have a bias in this fight, it is that I do like truth and transparency. And so in a world where the truth doesn't matter, I probably lean heavily on the idea, no, the truth will still matter. People will care about the truth. So I acknowledge that bias. If it's not true, I feel my own self slipping into some sort of nihilism. But so far, we did look at this. I mean, the technology is changing so quickly and so rapidly in all these areas, including AI-generated deepfakes. But so far, there's a bit of a debate, but the people and the research we did suggests that it's at least as good or better than the technology that is able to create the deepfakes. And so just as most people, I'm happy to be educated that I'm wrong on this, but most people still think, as an educator with students who might be cheating with AI, that the software to detect that kind of, if you want to call it plagiarism, that kind of use of technology can keep up with AI. So far, the folks that we've talked to said that it keeps pace. It is kind of an arms race, though, right? Like the malware gets stronger, you need a better malware software. I mean, it's not a coincidence, know. But I think so far it looks possible, but it's costly, right? I mean, there's a cost to all these transactions. Before, it would have been okay for Upton Sinclair to just type on his typewriter when he got home from the meat packing plants. I don't think that anyone would believe Upton Sinclair today. But then if you produce a video that purports to show this, and we all learn that you had made it as a deep fake and it's not real, it might take a week or 6 days to confirm that it's not real, because we're going through this. I think there's a real damage to truth in that process. And I'm scared of that. I mean, that's the other thing I would say about undercover investigations is I have never, at least not knowingly, supported an investigator who has, in the cases we're working on or the projects we're looking at, altered or doctored the footage or the audio. Again, it goes to my bias. Like, I do not want to support a realm where we're in an arms race to do that. It's not because I don't think there's any political power in it. It's not because I don't even know that it wouldn't be the most politically powerful thing to do for a cause. But it's not a game that I want to be engaged in.
That's terrific. So I think we're going to send it off to questions for the audience.
Hopefully you've been thinking of some questions to ask, and I'm running a microphone, and Lila's also running a microphone around. So Because of the layout of the room, we can't walk up and down a central aisle. If you've got a question in the middle, that's great. Raise your hand. We'll try to pass the microphone down. I kindly ask that you ask your question and then send the microphone back so you don't, let's say, bogart the microphone, as it were, and leave not enough room for other people to ask questions. So I think we've got one right here. Sorry.
You barely touched on something that's been concerning me for the last several years, which is deep fakes. But let's go a little bit beyond that. Let's go a little bit past that. Arguably, the case that brought Project Veritas, James O'Keefe to the public fore was the Acorn case. Now, there were no deep fakes in that. That was all done by manipulation of video footage. It was incredibly deceptive, and it was shown to be deceptive. No deep fakes, it was just editing. Would that be protected by the First Amendment?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I don't want to opine on that particular case because I have not looked at it. I have seen accounts that have said that exactly as you've conveyed it, that the editing of the footage, and I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, like hundreds of hours of material, but was deceptive in a way that. Right, well, I mean, for sure. I mean, companies have gone out of business on valid undercover investigations too. So, but there was truly harm, right? There is absolutely harm, and I think that there's the journalism I've seen covering it has suggested exactly as you have that there was true deception there. I don't know, like I won't take a position on whether that's true or false. But as to that claim, accepting those facts as true, which they may very well be. I had no involvement in that, and I believe it to be true based on what I've seen. If that's true. Then they would be liable for defamation. And it would be surprising to me. I mean, that's sort of, I've represented a lot of undercover investigators, and I have never been involved in an undercover investigation case where the first response of the individual or the entity is not to threaten defamatory liability and say that the investigation was doctored, manipulated, staged, not at our facility, and those kind of things. And we always say, both to the media and to their lawyers in-house, then bring a defamation case, and we'll have the discovery. And we're happy to have a media circus around this whole thing. If you think it was staged, if you think it was deceptively edited, then you have a cause of action. And so the answer to your question is no, it's not protected by the First Amendment. If it is in fact the case that the material was doctored to present a different perspective than reality, that entity has a cause of action for defamation that would fall outside of the protected speech.
Gabe, I just want to, as a footnote, feel free to jump in on any of these questions if you want to as well. I don't want to deny anybody your expertise or insight.
Well, so what's interesting, because I actually just filed something last week that involves the question of the First Amendment approach to selective editing of news content. I can't and won't comment on that specific case, but I will say that right now in front of the FCC has a rule. It's called the News Distortion Rule. It has virtually never been used. The only times it's actually been used in the context of a license renewal for an FCC licensee is in things like deceptive promotions for a station. Or there's one case where the news at a television station was so shaded that, and was also wrapped in a bunch of other wrongdoing, that the FCC found that the station basically became furthered the private interests of the owner of the licensed station. But the news distortion rule basically says that if you rig or slant the news, that is a violation of your public interest obligations, and you can have your license revoked. The FCC, because of the danger in that doctrine, that rule, requires what's called extrinsic evidence of deliberate distortion. In plain terms, it means you've got to show evidence that's outside of the broadcast that shows that the management wanted to actually falsify the news. However, the complaint that is open for a comment cycle involves the interview of former Vice President Kamala Harris, And the complaint, where there now is a comment cycle at the FCC, the complaint basically says that there was one spot on Face the Nation promoting her interview on 60 Minutes where they used one portion of an answer. And then on 60 Minutes, they used another portion of the answer. And the implication of the complaint is that it made her look better in the 60 Minutes interview, and that was somehow distorting the news. I don't mention this to talk to the merit or lack thereof of the complaint. However, this notion of selective editing, whether or at least editing of news content not receiving First Amendment protection could be of concern precisely, and this is a good example of why. If you give a government agency, and again, this is broadcast, so it's a different legal regime, but if you give a government agency the ability to act as an arbiter of truth, then it can come with significant problems.
Hi, I'm hearing more and more in our current administration about various statistical services that are being kind of wiped off the map. And to me, this is very concerning. I mean, it's everything from climate research to financial information and economic information. And I'm wondering how is that going to affect, number one, investigative journalism, and whether or not it will create a greater need for undercover investigations. And just the whole trend to me is rather frightening.
So it's a great question, and it's actually something we've been talking about at the Reporters Committee a fair amount, tracking tracking how that data is being removed from government websites, and as a legal matter, it's tricky, and I won't go into great detail, but there is one lawsuit that was brought, I believe, by a medical nonprofit, and one of the questions is whether you have standing, to bring a claim. But I believe that there is a lawsuit that is live right now that is effectively bringing a claim under the Administrative Procedures Act, that this act is outside the scope of the agency's power. But the law is a little tricky. As a normative matter, there is great concern that information is being, information is being lost, and and journalists may not be able to rely on it. In terms of how it impacts, investigative or at least undercover investigations, it also goes to the importance of protections, generally speaking, for investigative reporting, in order to get that information through other avenues if it is being removed from official avenues.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I don't do a lot of administrative law, but I know I helped coordinate some lawyers who are Freedom of Information Act experts. And the last time Trump was in office, they took some stuff down. It was, as I understand it, less in scope. And the clients that I referred them to with the FOIA lawyers did get a success, and there were 2 cases. So it's complicated and it's variable, but there are some avenues, and FOIA is still the law. So hopefully that continues to provide access to stuff. I mean, but when you take it down off the website, it becomes a complicated administrative law question, and I don't have the answers on that here, but I think. Yeah, anytime the information in general is being driven underground, there is a risk that there is no way to obtain it, right? And that's when the sort of soil for undercover investigations becomes more fertile. I mean, I worry about what undercover investigators will face in terms of persecution and prosecution in this government. But.
Over here. Food Lion case, when it was decided in 1996, I was working at the Reno Gazette-Journal as a reporter then, and the year before we had done stories based on undercover stuff. But once the Food Lion case came down, the corporate policy, as explained by the lawyer, was don't do it, don't do it, don't ever freaking do it. And 20 years later, they wouldn't even entertain the suggestion. I mean, it wasn't just the chill, it was the deep freeze. And I'm wondering, especially since in the last 20, 25 years, I haven't really seen a lot of undercover investigations elsewhere, if that is still the trend, that they're so scared of the fallout from Food Lion, even though the fraud was reversed on appeal, there's still that trespass question, there's still the breach of loyalty question. And even when those two things, the trespass and breach of loyalty, wasn't a factor, and I would talk to our newspaper attorney, they're like, no, we shouldn't be doing it at all, and just stay the hell away from it. Is that something that you've come across on a wider scale as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a great question, and like I said, one of the things that has been of immense interest to me over the course of this research is looking at drivers of increases and decreases in popularity and prevalence of undercover investigations. There's no question that the Food Lion case had that impact, and it's kind of surprising from a lawyer perspective, because from a lawyer perspective, you see that Food Lion was awarded $1, right? And you know, if I'm sitting on the board of directors somewhere and you're going to have a story of that magnitude and that import, and the risk is $1 of nominal damage liability, you know, I'm going to advise my entity that I'm on the board for to go for it. But you're absolutely right that that was not the advice. And one of the things that we note, right, I mean, I think that's why it's, I mean, one of the reasons I was excited to come here and sort of be introduced to the Reynolds School of Journalism is that we document in the book that after Food Lion, it wasn't just that newsrooms got conservative. It was that Food Lion's lawyers were actually introducing trainings that were being incorporated into some journalism schools. It became a norm that, like, look, you don't do this. Do you see how much trouble these kind of journalists in North Carolina got themselves into? You should steer far clear of that. And so there was this connection that's never been fully unpacked between the prosecution through litigation of those journalists who were really quite courageous, and then the education and the norms that emerge in the field. But as to your kind of empirical question of has it picked back up, I mean, we have news entities now, you know, it wasn't just Ben Bradley at the Pulitzer Prize in the 1970s. We have entities that have a policy against undercover investigations. We talk to the lawyers in some of those news shops. And so I think that your general empirical assessment is accurate. But as you know, I mean, the economics of the newsroom have shifted, and so there's this kind of democratizing of who is a journalist also and what they're doing. Are they doing a podcast? Are they doing there's other things, right? And so I work with a lot of filmmakers now who are doing undercover investigations all the time. There's a lot of undercover investigations being done by some, I won't list them here, but kind of the nonprofit model of media. Like they seem to not have policies against it, at least not as strong. So I still view in the post-Food Lion era, undercover investigations are largely frowned upon, and I don't think we've seen a Pulitzer Prize go to one. I may have missed one, but I don't think so. So I think that largely you're correct. But I think it's almost a historical anomaly. I mean, if I was facing $1 nominal damages to expose something, I would do that, make that decision every single day. I don't know, do you have?
No comment on giving legal advice.
Yeah, I'm definitely not telling you to go do it. It's a good catch.
I've got a question. Who's going to win in the Associated Press versus the White House when it goes to the Supreme Court? Will it go to the Supreme Court? And who's going to win from a legal standpoint, not the political standpoint?
So I don't have an answer. I wish I did. But certainly the issue that's raised in the case, I think, is particularly interesting, and it's one that us lawyers call a matter of first impression. There is case law involving the suspension or revocation or denial of press passes for the White House. So in the White House, there's something called a hard pass, where if you're a White House correspondent, you get one of these. You don't have to go through security the same way every time. And going back to the 70s, there were cases where the White House denied it. And during the first Trump administration, there were two cases, Jim Acosta at CNN and Brian Karem, both of whom had their press passes either denied or revoked or suspended. Those cases were due process cases. So the court, found that, one, you couldn't pull the press pass because you didn't like the content of the reporting. But they also found that if you did pull the press pass, you had to give the person notice, you had to give an opportunity to, plead their case, and you had to have reasonably clear rules as to why you would take that step. The AP case is not a credentials case, right? It is one denying AP reporters access to events that are open to what's called the press pool. So the White House for 100 years has had a system where, because there are areas in the White House with limited access, you can't have dozens and dozens of journalists in there, you have a pool system where journalists are selected to go in, they report, and then the rest of the White House press corps can use that information. And so what's happened initially was the White House started barring access for Associated Press reporters from pool events, and then also from events that were open more broadly to the White House press corps, which is legally irrelevant. The other thing that's happened in that case is that the Associated Press sued, and I'll go back to that in a second. Right after the Associated Press sued, the White House announced that it was going to change a system that it has had in place going back to the Eisenhower administration, where the White House Correspondents Association coordinates the logistics of the pool system, including selecting who is in the pool. The White House said, we're going to take that over, and we will now be selecting who is in the pool. With the AP case, now going back to the thing that it's not about credentials, one of the more interesting things about the AP case is that it is explicitly what the lawyers call viewpoint-based, right? In other words, the White House has said that it is taking these actions because the Associated Press has an editorial standard that it will refer to the Gulf of Mexico, which was renamed by the Trump administration as Gulf of America, that it would continue to use the term Gulf of Mexico, but would acknowledge the renaming of that body of water. So that viewpoint, the fact that they've said that it's viewpoint-based, means that there's a whole other body of law that you can point to. And the basic idea is that even if the White House is under no obligation to let anybody, public, press, anybody, onto White House grounds, that once it starts to do so, and it lets some press be there and sets up the system, the pool system, the White House press corps, how all of that works, once it does that, it can't exclude people or discriminate among these members of the press based on viewpoint. So there's no case dealing with this set of facts, right? So I think it really is, anybody's guess in terms of how it's going to play out in the courts. But what is certainly true is that this basic notion, right? The court's viewpoint discrimination, because it lets the government pick and choose in public debates, has been called by the courts poison to a free society. It is almost never allowed. And you've got a case where you have viewpoint discrimination right front and center, but in terms of the government action that's being taken, there's no case on point. So it's a really so from an academic perspective, it's very interesting. In terms of how it plays out, we'll see.
Well, I mean, I think you helped us in the Wyoming case. I mean, it's actually analogous. We had a case. It's not about the AP at all, but about sort of limits on access. And essentially, I mean, a distilled version of the statute would be criminalizing trespass for persons with certain viewpoints, or making it heightened trespass or viewpoints. And the court said you can't do that, right? So we had even briefed it as like, imagine that you said it was at the time Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump running for president, think back to then, like you couldn't say it is trespass if you are a Donald Trump supporter or you're wearing a Donald Trump shirt, but not otherwise. That sort of say. Now you could remove somebody from your property privately, but the state action of expressing that preference was said to violate the First Amendment.
Hi there. I have my question written down. So many of the historical examples cited tonight are regarding legacy media in a time when barriers to publishing and access to an audience was much steeper. Now, anyone can publish, anyone can reach an audience. Who and what is protected by the legal safeguards that have historically been thought of to apply to and protect journalists and reporters with official media outlets doing undercover work?
So,
I have lots to say about it, so I want to give Gabe a time.
well, so just, if the question is, what are the legal safeguards for folks who are engaged in journalistic activity, and does that depend on where they're employed? The short answer is that, and actually, so at the Reporters Committee, we actually train police officers on how to interact with journalists at protests. And the first question I always get is, who's a journalist? And with all of these TikTokers and Facebookers and how do I tell, right? And the short answer to that is it usually doesn't matter, right? Because certainly in the protest context, and that can actually bleed over to lots of other contexts, the rights of the press and public are pretty much coextensive. There are certain instances where, and this is an evolving area of law, in the protest context, there may be instances where where journalists, for instance, are exempt from curfews. And so law enforcement may need to make determinations of who qualifies as a journalist and who doesn't. And there's some guidance in the law in terms of how you do that. But the short answer is that in most cases, right, the courts have treated the speech clause in the First Amendment and the press clause in the First Amendment as generally the same thing. And so it doesn't, with a few exceptions, it doesn't usually matter. Now, in cases where, for instance, the Federal Press Act, which is a reporter's, most states have a law that protects journalists from having to disclose confidential sources or disclose confidential news gathering material in legal proceedings. There is no federal law, despite us trying to pass one for 20 years now. In that context, you may need to have a definition of covered journalist, but the way that we approach it, as lawyers, is a functional definition. So it's some type of you're intentionally collecting information that you intend to then disseminate to the public, and that information is of public concern or it's newsworthy, or something like that. But so the two answers are: one, it usually doesn't matter, and then two, when it does matter, the approach that you take is this functional approach.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I think there's a reading of the historic First Amendment cases that you may be sort of gesturing at least in the legal literature, that suggests that they are often decided in a way that privileges legacy media and these kind of entities. I'm sympathetic to that reading. I understand that critique. The work that I do, I even am trying to have a press clause that would not be coterminous with the free speech clause, and that there should be, but that's aspirational. We don't know what this court would do about it. We don't, and that might have some differentiation, but for the reasons that Gabe just said, we're litigating these matters as a matter of free speech, and as pointed out earlier, a lot of the big shops don't allow undercover investigations, not of the type I was talking about, not of the type that you saw in the Mirage Bar, not of the, this is like the New York Times prohibits it. So we're talking much more about a new generation that is a bit edgier, and those protections are going to work. Most of the cases, so I have a legal clinic that defends activists, and it's often in these type of spaces, and there's media lawyers that will help with the charges against, a big Fox News or somebody who's facing something. And occasionally we have a state or somebody say something like, well, she's not a real journalist. But that has not held up. It hasn't been, I haven't had a single case that I've worked on where that has been a factor why they've lost. I mean, I think it's super interesting to talk about, like, okay, you don't have credentials, can the police move you out? Like, those kind of questions on, like, the procedure of, like, only journalists are allowed, who's the journalist? But I think even those are subject to First Amendment challenges. I mean, I think that, like, if I was treated differently than the journalist, I would want to express some concerns about that. So.
Hello. The Nevada Supreme Court is about to hear a case brought by two elected public officials who had their vehicles, had a GPS device attached to their vehicles by a private investigator. The issue is not whether or not it was done, but whether whoever it was that hired this individual to track these public officials, whether that individual ought to be able to remain anonymous. I don't know that they're claiming to have been an undercover reporter, but how do you see the First Amendment, which I'm sure is part of the defense there, playing out in a case like that?
I mean, that's directly in the realm of work that Gabe works on. I mean, I would. I mean, shield law, does that no, not quite. I mean, I tend to think. I mean, if I go back and think about Stanford Daily News and that line of cases, you know, I mean, generally the protections for the newsrooms have been less than I would have thought ideal when they are holders of, you know, evidence in criminal cases, and so we've seen search warrants and that kind of thing. I am working on a case right now that is analogous in the sense that the New Jersey Attorney General's office, which at the moment is leaning left of center, is going after a number of right of center of organizations and demanding their donor lists. And we have a number of sort of left of center groups that we're representing and saying, like, this would be a bad idea. I think there are plenty of causes on the left that want to have anonymity as well. And I think that there is a strong First Amendment claim there. I think that there are First Amendment interests in association, so it's a different thing that I think of it that are implicated by required disclosure. As a matter of federal constitutional law, I think that remaining anonymous for having placed, you know, funded and placed a tracker on someone's car, I don't have a case on mind, but it strikes me as an uphill battle to remain anonymous as a matter of federal constitutional law. But Nevada may have different protections.
I need to think about that one for a while. Yeah. Yeah, I don't. I mean, it's. I share your inclination that you know, as a matter of federal constitutional law, it may be, you know, may be difficult. It's also, I guess, you know, why were they placed? You know, may factor into it. But you're, you know, entirely right. I mean, if that was somehow a criminal act, then you know, and you've got, you know, probable cause to get information that will disclose the identity of the individual. I'm not sure the argument you can make.
I know that you have many questions, but we have to go home at one point. Okay, so thank you. I think thank you all for such great questions. At this time, I'd like to call Janet and Warren's son, Eric Lerude, to the stage for a special presentation.
Thank you, Dean Yoon. On behalf of my parents, Warren and Janet, and my sister, Leslie, and her husband, Dan, who are here tonight, it is my privilege to say thank you to Professor Justin Marceau for your distinguished comments tonight. We appreciate the many insights you've shared about undercover investigations, and I very much look forward to reading your book. And for those who haven't seen this yet, this is, Justin has brought this tonight, and there are plenty of extra copies out front, and he will happily sign a copy for you, so thank you. I also want to thank Gabe for your very thoughtful questions and your vital comments in the forum as well. We are lucky to hear from both of you tonight, so thank you. I want to thank everyone in the audience for being here, attending, and participating. It's also my pleasure to acknowledge and thank the three people who helped the most to put together this inaugural Lerude First Amendment Distinguished Lecture Forum. And that is Dean Yoon, which is he's standing back here. Professor Patrick File, where are you, Patrick? Thank you very much. And Development Director Carol McIntosh. We appreciate all of your efforts, and thanks to everyone else also who contributed at the J School and at UNR. Before I present a special award to Justin, I want to say a few words about my parents, Warren and Janet. Throughout my dad's long and distinguished career as a journalist, then as a journalism professor, the First Amendment has always been his ultimate guiding principle. Because the First Amendment has had such a significant impact on both of my parents, and because of their love of the Reynolds School of Journalism and their longstanding commitment to this school, they wanted to create this forum. They wanted to acknowledge the importance of a free and independent press and to further the J School's mission in First Amendment education for not only the students here, but also for the university community and the general public. We are grateful that my parents are here tonight to witness this inaugural, excuse me, didn't expect that necessarily, to witness this inaugural year of this program that bears our family name. So, if you wouldn't mind, let's give them one more well-deserved big round of applause. And I think at this time, Dean Yoon has some flowers for you as well. One last thing for me. Now, finally, on behalf of my family, it is my privilege to present to Professor Justin Marceau the first and of what will become the annual Lerude First Amendment Distinguished Lecture Award.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take a picture together. Oh, you want a picture? Back for a picture. Where's that? Where is she? Oh, sorry. I'll stand right here.
Okay. This brings out our 2025 Lerude First Amendment Distinguished Lecture Forum to a close. Inaugural First Amendment Forum. Thank you again, Justin and Gabe, for your insightful talk, as well as the Lerude family for their support in making this event possible, and all of you joining us this evening. Stay safe and have a good night. Thank you for coming. Thank you.